We're on the air with Marco Mangelsdorf in Hilo, Hawaii. And he's with Provision Solar, and we're talking about energy here, the Hawaii's integration of solar today. Welcome again to the show, Marco.
Thanks so much, Jay.
Yeah, I'd like to start our discussion with your recollections and your reactions to the Solar in Hawaii panel program, luncheon panel program we did with the Hawaii Venture Capital Association at the end of, September, I want to say September 26th, at the Plaza Club, and you were on the panel, and the whole idea was to evaluate the solar industry and see what was going to happen to it in the long haul. You gave some interesting remarks, and I wonder if you could review those remarks and your takeaway points with our audience today, 2 weeks later.
Sure, I'd be happy to. You all asked us to choose one word to kind of base our remarks and the 5 or so minutes that we had before the group there, the assembled gathering. And the word I chose was turbulent, or turbulence, because that is clearly what's happening in the PV industry across the Aloha State these days. Given the incredible growth that we had in 2012, where there was more PV permitted and installed in one single year than there were in the previous 20 years combined, and that has led to what I kind of come up with a new metaphor to describe what we've been seeing in terms of the industry, which is a solar roller coaster, as I describe it, the solar roller coaster, because if you look at the permit numbers over the past 12 to 24 months, the up and down activity has really been quite dramatic, and there were a number of stakeholders both presenting on that particular day in Honolulu, and also, of course, I think, how many did you have? Somewhere over 100 people attending.
Well,
and
we had 180 people show up for that, though. It seemed like to me the whole industry was there. Yes,
it was very well attended, and it just shows to me the incredible interest there is in what's going on in the industry right now. And, you know, I think I would distill it to a couple of fairly simple to understand yet difficult to digest concepts, and that is that in the short term at least, there is a reduced demand for photovoltaic grid-tie systems certainly compared to last year at this time. Mm-hmm. And the market is shrinking, and there are simply too many players. Too many players, what I mean by that are contractors, both on Oahu and across the state, who are trying to get a piece of the PV pie. And we have started to see what one noted economist described a number of decades ago, a fellow by the name of Joseph Schumpeter, who was Austrian-American, and he coined the phrase creative destruction. Creative destruction in terms of what capitalist economics go through, economic systems go through over time, as there are disruptions to existing technologies and the supply and demand both waxes and wanes for various kinds of products. So we're on the downside, unfortunately, of the at least near-term demands for what companies like mine and others are providing to Hawaii residents.
Yeah, I was, you've written about that, you've talked about that, you've sent me materials about it, but what I caught at this program was that it's not you alone. In other words, I mean, you're reporting a true fact, and the other people in the room, essentially knew that fact. So it was confirmation, Marco, of your proposition on this matter. It's not in a vacuum. It's really happening. And I guess the question I would put to you is exactly what are the factors that are making this decline take place? It's you say that it's a slackening of the market, but why is the market slackening at a time when every man jack wants to put solar on his roof?
Well, in a simplistic yet descriptive phrase, I think I would use the phrase that we are to some degree that we are victims of our own success. That there was such a dramatic increase in demand for this product that was spurred from a number of different directions, that the utility companies in the states, and in this particular case on Oahu, HECO, was I won't use the word overwhelmed because perhaps that's using an exaggeration, but the utility saw so much PV installed, permitted installed so quickly over a rather short period of time that their ability to cope with the higher levels of distributed generation saturation, in this case PV saturation, and circuit after circuit, essentially outpaced their ability to deal with this level of saturation in a timely fashion. And we're seeing the blowback, the pushback on the demand for the product right now, in terms of there are more and more circuits which have been impacted, and HECO is taking a more cautious, and in my opinion, a necessarily cautious approach in terms of going where very few, if any, mainland utilities have gone, as far as having the percentage of a given circuit accepting power from all these multiple hundreds or if not thousands of photovoltaic systems. And essentially we're charting a new ground. We're on uncharted territory in the state as far as just how far any utility, any electric utility, can go as far as accepting more and more distributed generation in the form of PV.
Okay, so HECO is concerned about that, and they're taking steps to be cautious, sort of the precautionary approach. But how, in fact, what is the, call it the market mechanism, or for that matter, the technical mechanism that slows down the market? That creates a saturation or creates a reduction in customer demand for solar, and so, as you point out, the decline of solar installations in the state. How is HECO creating that? I mean, what is HECO doing to create that decline?
Well, word is getting out. There's been more and more press from both the printed media, electronic, television, that there are issues that utility companies are having in terms of more and more PV connected to the grid and feeding power into the grid. And as that information diffuses across the public, that most likely is creating more of an uncertainty in terms of, gee, is this something that if I go ahead and commit to purchasing or acquiring a 20,000 or 40,000 or more thousand photovoltaic system, will I be able to, with 100% confidence, connect, in fact, to the grid? Because if you cannot connect to the grid, if for some reason there's going to be a study needed that will take X number of tens of thousands of dollars and it may take 6 months, 12 months, or longer, then that puts an unacceptable level of doubt in the minds of more and more homeowners as far as, well, I don't want to go down this road if, when all is said and done, I cannot have my system connected to the utility, which in fact renders that purchase of zero value.
Well, it sounds like that's nearly all of the buyers. There's very few people that opt to go off the grid. They all want to have, the comfort, the security of being on the grid. So I guess what you're saying is that if, assuming that nearly 100% or maybe as much as 100% of the buyers need to be on the grid and don't have confidence, then they reconsider their decision to get into photovoltaic, and they don't do it.
That's right, and as I mentioned, there are stories, more and more stories coming out in the press where you have a homeowner who has committed and has actually a system installed on their roof and ready to operate, and are in some kind of limbo land as to when and if they're going to be able to go online and actually connect to the grid and start generating some value from their purchase or their investment.
So what do? They stop short?
Excuse me?
They stop short? They don't actually connect until they get permission?
Well, I mean, that's the way the game is played out here, rightly so, because, I mean, to me it's indisputable that any utility, any electric utility, has to necessarily have control over what power sources feed into their grid. I don't think that's disputable. Mm-hmm. What's disputable is what that mix of power can and should be between what's known in the business as firm power, typically combustion turbines, or steam plants that you have confidence are going to be on 100% of the time or pretty darn close, and then you have non-firm power, which typically is wind and solar. And we have very ambitious goals, in my opinion, through the HCEI Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative going back to 2008 to hit a 40% renewable by 2030, if memory serves correctly. And in order to do that, a lot more non-firm power is going to have to feed into the grids of the state, the electric grids of the state. And the big question is how the grids are going to be able to accommodate in a cost-effective, practical fashion so much more non-firm power. So,
yeah, well, I think what I hear you saying is that we've reached a point where there's a kind of glass ceiling on this. We're not going to be able to reach the goal with photovoltaic or any renewable which is non-firm, and our whole initiative is going to have to slow down because of these problems in integrating the renewables into the grid. And we're at a certain problematic point. Am I right?
I think that's a fair assessment, Jay. And my concern has been for the past several years is that the facts on the ground in terms of more and more homeowners, business owners wanting PV and getting PV, that it was just moving, especially last year, which was this beyond monster year for all of us in the business, that the pace of PV going in has effectively outpaced the technical fixes, practical, cost-effective, off-the-shelf technical fixes to be able to go where no utilities or very few utilities have gone before as far as integrating so much non-firm power into the grid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll be right back, Marco. We'll take a very short break. That's Marco Mangelsdorf of Provision Solar. We're on the phone with him in Hilo, Hawaii. We're talking about Hawaii's integration of solar here on ThinkTech Talks on Tuesday. I'm Jay Fidell. We'll be right back after this short break.
Aloha, my name is Dan Bauer and I'm the General Manager of the Plaza Club. The Plaza Club is Honolulu's premier business club. We're located in the heart of the financial district on historic Fort Street Mall. On the 20th and 21st floors atop the Pioneer Plaza, our commanding skyline views, along with our award-winning cuisine and service, are known as the place to do business downtown. We offer professional as well as social events and programs to our members and their guests, all tailored to enrich their professional and personal lives and to give them the cutting edge that they deserve in business. Why don't you consider becoming a member of the club? Call me at 531-7788 or come see me and let's talk business and how the Plaza Club can work for you. Again, my name is Dan Bauer. I'm the General Manager of the club and I'm here for you.
Welcome back. I'm Jay Fidell here on ThinkTech Talks. We're talking with Marco Mangelsdorf by telephone at his company in Hilo, Hawaii, Provision Solar, about Hawaii's integration of solar. He was at our program called Solar in Hawaii, How's It Going to Do for the Long Haul, on September 26th, and we're reviewing some of the issues that were discussed that day. So Marco, before the break, we talked about, the problem of reaching kind of a glass ceiling in non-firm renewables like solar into the grid. And you mentioned that, the technology hasn't kept up with the amount of these non-firm renewables. But what technology can we hope for? What technology could be out there to resolve this problem and allow us to take more non-firm solar onto the grid?
Well, there are two ways to approach that. It's a really critical question. One is what can be done on the customer side of the utility grid, which is going to be at the site of this or that homeowner or this or that business that has a PV system. And then there's also the question of what the utility can do on their side of the meter within their grid, within their infrastructure, to be able to go substantially higher than what they are currently able to accept in terms of PV right now. To look at look on the customer side of the meter, there's been a fair amount of discussion about some type of storage medium which would be able to effectively modulate the amount of solar power that was coming from any individual system over time and have it, let's say, be more smooth and steady over, let's say, a 24-hour time period, which would be much preferable to the utility company rather than have it spike at 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon and then go down. And that has been the focus of a lot of interest. And my friend Joseph Cherney at Island Pacific Energy, who was also a panel member back a couple weeks ago at the Plaza Club, and he's come up with something which he calls his Empower system, which is using various switchgear and batteries to be able to try to go in that direction. Mm-hmm. But I tell you what the big challenge is that I can challenge in doing that. At the end of the day, any utility company is still going to be posing a really fundamental question, which is how much maximum power can this or that system feed into the grid? Because they need that figure to be able to determine overall caps for that circuit and just to get a clear idea of what the maximum generating capacity is of all this cumulative number of PV systems in this or that circuit. And when you have a battery-based system, how do you factor in, how do you calculate what the amount of power is that's going to be feeding into the grid at any given time? Mm-hmm. And that is something that I'm sure minds brighter than mine at HECO and elsewhere on the mainland are thinking about and trying to figure out. But that's not going to be a decision, from what I can tell, is going to be made this week, next month, or within the next several months. It is both a technical and practical conundrum in terms of, well, to what degree will battery-based grid-type PV systems, to what degree, how much will they affect the overall production of power at what rate of that PV power feeding into the grid?
Yeah, well, it strikes me that although the batteries, like in Joe Saturnia's Empower system, the Empower Empire, those batteries are, at the consumer end of things. And although you could have a smart grid connection between those batteries and the utilities, grid equipment, it's probably not as proximate as if you had the storage equipment within the control of the utility, and the utility became the person responsible to create and maintain the storage. It also strikes me that, and this is for your comment, it also strikes me that until we resolve this storage issue, one way or the other, we're never going to be able to solve this glass ceiling. And we're always going to have contention between those who would like to put additional non-firm power onto the grid and the utility that doesn't know, where the red line is, and is concerned that if it takes too much, it's going to damage its own ability to generate power on the grid and leave us with and provide for us secure power. So to me, this is really part of the, it's the crisis of trying to find a way to store power, and we don't have that way, so we keep on bouncing off that problem. And right now, correct me if I'm wrong, there is no systemic way to do that. Not on the drawing boards, and certainly not in reality. So we really have to, we're going to be forced more and more to find a storage solution at the utility level. How much of that do you agree with?
Well, I mean, our utility friends, in my opinion, are truly working hard across the state to try to see just how far they can go in accepting non-firm DG into their grids. And of course, there are a number of people in my industry who don't feel that they have been proactive enough or that they've worked fast enough to come up with solutions. And that, of course, is a debate that many people can have. And at the end of the day, there may or may not be much consensus on that.
Well, I've heard it said, Marco, I've heard it said a number of times that the smart grid by itself, as an intelligent, highly communicating grid, will be able to ameliorate this problem. I mean, is that what is going on, that we're building a smart grid that in and of itself, by reason of the allocation of power and resources, around the grid, that itself will solve the problem?
Well, I have to respectfully disagree on that, Jay, and I'll tell you, I have a pet peeve with that two-word phrase, smart grid, because if you get 20 people in a room who claim they know something about what a smart grid is or what it should do, you may or may not get a whole lot of consensus. But to me, that's more kind of a buzzword or buzz phrase that in today's reality doesn't really correspond to a hard and fast reality. Now, in principle, we can speculate as to what a smart grid would look like. It would be a lot less one directional in terms of power flow, and you would have power flowing in a more back and forth bidirectional way. But there are no, in my opinion, there are no easy, quick fix smart grid solutions in the near term for us collectively to blast through, as you put it, that glass ceiling. I wanted to mention as well another possible mitigating means that the utilities can do, whether here or on the mainland, to be able to accept more PV. As it is, there are many PV systems in the States that of the larger size, which can be anywhere from 100 to, let's say, several hundred kilowatts in capacity or even larger, where the utilities require something known as a direct transfer trip, or DTT, a direct transfer trip. And what that does is essentially it is a remote controllable disconnect, which allows the utility to disconnect the output of any given, in this case, large commercial PV system, if certain conditions happen to arise upstream in either the distribution or transmission system of the grid in that particular area. So it allows them remotely to disconnect the output of that system if there's some type of fault or other type of error condition. And that is a means of protecting the grid, protecting the reliability of the grid, and also protecting people who are connected to the grid.
What's interesting about that, though, Marco, is that it's a physical disconnect, because these power panels, these PV panels, keep generating electricity all the time, and you're physically disconnecting it and thus wasting all the power that is at the same moment being generated. What a shame! What a waste!
Well, and that the utilities typically call that curtailment, because, like you just said, the output of the system is in effect curtailed. And in theory, it is possible that you could take that approach of using direct transfer trip and not say simply that it's for larger systems of 100 kilowatts or 500 kilowatts or megawatts. You could also downsize it to the 10 kilowatt or under range for much smaller systems, which, look, I mean, no one who invests in a photovoltaic system could possibly be pleased with the idea, in theory, that their system could be turned off and production that could be made is essentially wasted because their system is turned off. No one would, of course, be pleased about that. However, if in the short term that is one of the ways, practically, and with the equipment available off the shelf, if that's one of the ways to go far beyond the current levels of penetration, then, you know, we don't live in a perfect world. There are typically not perfect options. If this is the best, most available, cost-effective option available to us in the industry and to homeowners, then most likely that's the direction we should go in, because, again, you look at the alternative of hitting the glass ceiling and we're stuck until there's some type of breakthrough as far as on-site storage, or the utilities are able to truly go in the direction of the vaunted, almost mythical smart grid and be able to accept a lot more DG.
Yeah, so what happens is, with that approach, with this chip, you do have connection. And, you know, at a time when you're not doing any destructive, oversupply to the utility, you're connecting, you're working, and it's a matter of turning you off when it would be a problem. But you don't have to wait months or years before you get permission to connect. So there's a benefit in growing the system with this chip. I guess what I'm interested in is where are we on. I believe, unless you correct me on this, I believe that the smart grid, however that's ill-defined, is not by itself enough. Just communications and wiring systems. It's not enough to actually permit more energy, more non-firm energy to be connected, that you have to have a storage mechanism. And if we had a storage mechanism, all this problem, this whole conversation would be moot. Joe Saturnia, is trying that with the Empower, but I'm wondering, and I'd like your opinion on this, I'm wondering why we can't invent right here in Hawaii some kind of mechanism that would, instead of wasting that non-firm power, transmit it, transform it into, convert it into, say, hydrogen in tanks. And then when it's needed again, at night, what have you, then it would be drawn off the tanks into a fuel cell, generator and come back online again, effectively smoothing out the curve and having an unlimited ability to store power. Why can't we do that?
Well, you're kind of a man of my own heart, Jay, because I've thought something similar for a number of years in terms of taking excess power, or somehow when the demand for power drops as it does every single night of the year from, let's say, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., somehow using some of that capacity as generators are still spinning away to electrolyze water and create hydrogen and oxygen. And I've long kind of puzzled as to why our utility friends or some other bright group of people haven't been able to get some type of grant money to be able to do something on a pilot basis. I know my friend Steve Holmes, who used to be in the Hawaii County Council, the Council of Oahu, Honolulu.
Yeah.
This was something that he was interested in and pursued when he was working under Mayor Jeremy Harris. But once the successor to Harris came in, that apparently stopped more or less dead in its tracks. So there have been efforts over time, sporadically, to try to go in that direction. And why more progress has not been made, I really don't know. I can tell you, in teaching my Politics of Energy class, which I'm doing at UH Hilo right now, that's a number of weeks ago when I was looking at the Hawaii energy situation, I was speaking in my class about the possibility of hydrogen, and I was able to find a report done back 13 years ago, dated 2000, looking at the very bright future of hydrogen being able to do a lot more in our state's economy to be able to get us off this, what everybody seems to agree, dangerous dependence and over-reliance on imported fossil fuels. Well, lo and behold, now we're 13 years later, and what has been done regarding hydrogen?
We had the hydrogen fund during the Lingle administration, went nowhere. Money's not being used. It's still there. It's not being used for hydrogen. And I think what's an interesting, kind of obstacle for hydrogen development is that there are no hydrogen cars. And
right.
If you thought that, drawing off and converting the, say, excess non-firm power into hydrogen and then using them for hydrogen cars would be an appropriate, work path, that, I think people say, well, there are no hydrogen cars, so we can't do that. But that's not true, because we could draw that extra power off and put it in hydrogen in a tank, and we can hold it in the tank until we need it for anything. And as and when there are hydrogen cars, we can use it for hydrogen cars. But for now, we can use it at night, when the grid can take it. So, I think there's still a real possibility. I understood that HNEI was working on some device that could be used in the geothermal facility at PGV in the Big Island. But I haven't heard much about that lately. But let's shift, if you don't mind. I'd like to shift for the last part of our discussion back again to the glass ceiling for the industry. So, the industry has grown. Last I heard, there were 342 contractors out there putting photovoltaic on roofs. And now you have this decline. Some of them have lost substantial percentages of business. I recall some statement to the effect that one company that was doing very well, in the tens of millions of gross, has had its gross cut by half.
Right.
That's a sad story. And there's been consolidation. There's consolidation going on right now. And I guess the question I put to you is, how is the industry, which over the past few years has come together? It has a trade association. It's very vocal at the legislature, with the government and the press and so forth. How has the industry reacted to the fact that there are more suppliers, more installations, some 36,000 in the state now, and not enough, and too much energy, well, and it's suffering. The industry is suffering. How has the industry reacted to that?
Well, a number of words come to mind. I think there's been a certain franticness, to say the least, and if you look at some of the rhetoric and hyperbole coming from a number of industry trade groups and a number of contractors, it's the rhetoric is bordering on apocalyptic, if not having crossed that line, where there's talk of bankruptcies and revenue being down as much as 75%, and to what extent that is self-serving and trying to impress upon HECO that dramatic changes are needed so that HECO rolls back the glass ceiling. I don't think I'm going to go there, but I'll go back to what I first led with saying, which is that on Oahu alone, over the past 12, 18 months, 270 plus different contractors have pulled PV permits for an island of approximately 1 million in terms of population. And I don't think you could go anywhere in the country and come anything close to that level of not just competition, but hyper-competition. So we're in a situation where there will necessarily have to be a downsizing of the players, because the new normal is that there is not enough of market, not enough demand to be able to support that level of contractors. And I mean, to be candid with you, my business is going to be down this year probably somewhere 25-30% compared to last year. But I was planning for that and knew, or at least felt strongly, that there was going to be the downside of the roller coaster starting much sooner than a lot of people thought. So it impacts me less probably than it does those contractors who just decided to essentially go all in and expand their operations, their personnel, their infrastructure across the board to a substantial degree to try to ride the roller coaster to however high it was going to go. So I'm not unsympathetic by any means to the real pain which so many of my colleagues are going through. But, I mean, that is, I believe, going to be the new normal. And, within 6 to 12 months, if you look at the top 15 players on Oahu, I would guess that, perhaps as many of a handful of them are either going to be gone completely or greatly diminished, or will have decided to get out of PV and gone back to standard electrical contracting or plumbing or roofing or whatever other trade essentially they came from.
Well, how interesting. Well, it strikes me that from what you say, it's not just the little guys, the last entries, the marginal players that are going to disappear, somehow get consolidated, but it's the big entries too, including the entries maybe that came from the mainland. So I mean, all of them, I guess, are affected by this, and I wonder, how well are they taking it? Are they? I presume they're unhappy about it. You're philosophical about it, and you saw it coming. So, hats off to you. But I'm wondering if you're not the norm. You're the exception. How is the average, solar contractor taking this, and how is the Solar Association taking this?
Well, if you read the rhetoric, review what was presented at a legislative briefing in Honolulu at the Capitol building a week ago yesterday on the 14th from a couple of trade groups, electric trade groups. I mean, they're not taking it well at all. There is a very painful concern about what it's going to do for their bottom line for this year, a very painful concern for what it's going to do for their employment situation in terms of their employees having reduced hours, is not being let go. So I don't downplay that or minimize that at all. And my empathy goes out to them.
But you know what's interesting is that the arguments that the Solar Association and its members make so often, not only, well, I guess it's in the legislature, probably in that hearing. I have footage from that hearing, which I will actually make into an OC-16 movie one day soon, in entirety. But at that hearing and in connection with the tax credit issues that come up every year, they are saying, if you don't give us a break, a tax credit to incentivize more solar, construction, then we will lose jobs, and our industry will suffer, and thus the state economy will suffer. Right. And I mean that does make some sense, and I wouldn't be unsympathetic to that. But it also seems directed from a kind of self-interest, from an industry self-interest point of view, and I wonder if it is really addressed to the common good, which I think is very important. This point came up yesterday in the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum member meeting to distinguish whether a given member of the forum, a given member of the industry, was speaking strictly out of self-interest or out of an abiding policy level of serving the common good of the state. Comments?
Well, you bring up a very juicy subject, and one that's not without quite a bit of controversy, in my opinion. And let me pose a quick question to you. Do you know, Jay, when the very first Hawaii solar tax credit went into effect?
Long time ago, wasn't it?
1976.
Yeah.
There has been a solar tax credit in some form or another in our state for 37 years.
Yeah.
Now, to me, and I wrote about this earlier this year, to me that really begs the question, what is the purpose of this type of government handout? Because effectively that's what it is.
Yep.
Is it designed, or should it be designed to essentially allow for an economy of scale, reduction in price, and mass adoption that allows this or that industry to stand up on its own 2 feet? Or is it a necessary, almost handout in perpetuity, because the current state tax credit has, as of now, no sunset date? Is it seen as something good and necessary in order to get us where we need and want to go in terms of less dependence on imported fossil fuels and to get to the magic 40% renewable by 2030? And that is a policy debate that will be had yet again once the legislature reopens in January. And what will be interesting is that right around that time should be when the Department of Taxation should be releasing the figures for what the renewable energy tax credit hit was, not for 2013, but for 2012, which was, of course, the monster year.
Yeah, the big year.
Right around the time when the legislature will open for business, there should be those figures in the public domain, which will let the legislators know just what that hit was on the state's general fund from that monster year. And I think that's going to play a role in the legislature's yet again effort to try to do something about this tax credit law, which, like I said, currently has no sunset date.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that the figures of how much it cost the state government to run these tax credits, to pay these tax credits in 2012, that is going to be a monster number because it was a monster year. And right. it will be the number on the table, even though we all know that 2013 was much less successful. The number from 2012 is the one that's going to have everybody's attention, and it will be a bad feature for the industry in the sense that everybody will think, well, that is costing the taxpayers too much. This has a faint, if not a stark, parallel to Act 221, right. Where the naysayers year after year were examining how much money it was costing the state, and that kind of inquiry and the criticism that came out of that inquiry ultimately eroded the statute and the whole credit out of existence, and that kind of thing may happen here.
Well, I wanted to mention as well, out of the interest of fairness, is that noted state economist Thomas Lodat has written extensively over the years and looked at this question of for every dollar that the general fund does not get in terms of a tax, because of the tax credit for solar, for every dollar the state doesn't get to the general fund, it's his assertion and his analysis that the state reaps $2 or $3, if I'm not mistaken, $2 or $3 in benefits in the other part of the equation for every dollar the state general fund does not get. So, you know, whether I agree with that is kind of beside the point, but there is that competing analysis that says, yeah, look, we're looking at it the wrong way. It's not a hit on the general fund as much as it is all the benefits in terms of employment and additional tax revenue that the state is getting from the sale of these systems. So I just wanted to make that point.
We made the same arguments around Act 221, exactly the same argument.
Right.
But over the long haul, it was not persuasive on the legislature, I have to tell you.
Right.
Anyway, gee, there's much more to talk about, Marco. I'm sorry we got started a little late, but we do have the technology to do this again. And I want to say farewell for now, but with the idea that we'll come back and resume this discussion. I have many more questions I'd like to take up with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Jay. It's always a pleasure and a challenge to try to come up with coherent and thoughtful answers to your very good and probing questions. So please know that I'm available whenever you'd like me to come back. Okay,
that's Marco Mangelsdorf. Watch for his articles in the newspaper. He is very thoughtful, and he always has data to back up his statements and concerns. He's with Provision Solar in Hilo, Hawaii. And we like to talk to him by telephone every so often. This is ThinkTech Talks, Energy on Tuesday. Today, the Hawaii's integration with solar. Thank you again, Marco.
Thank you.
Aloha.